Hi, my name is Dustin Van Wechel, and I'm an artist who's been working in oil paints for about 20 years. I'm hoping with this workshop to bring to you a set of tools, approaches, techniques you can use to improve your work, in particular, the lighting and color in your work. I started my career in advertising, left in 2002, and focused my work mainly on Rocky Mountain Western wildlife. We're going to start with a demonstration on how to use photographic reference to build not only complex paintings, but simpler paintings like the one behind me that I'll be demoing. So welcome to my workshop. Happy you're joining me, and let's get started. So let's talk a little bit about building a painting from the ground up and where that all starts. For me, that always begins with a series of thumbnail sketches. These sketches are very rough, and they're really just designed to give me a sense of the shapes, where they fall, how the values will work, the largest values in terms of the extreme darks, extreme lights, etc., what that structure is, and also the design, flow, and composition of the piece. So I might do as many as 25 or so thumbnail sketches. I have an idea in my head of where I want the piece to go. I also have somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 plus pieces of photographic reference I've accumulated over my years as a wildlife painter, combined with sketches as well as plein air paintings that I've done. And I have all of that sort of in my head. So I have a sense of what is available to me in order to make a painting work. So when I design the thumbnails, I design it with that in mind. And so you can see here that this is a thumbnail sketch for a painting of mine called Apika's Paradise. I had just spent some time in Banff and Jasper National Parks in Canada. I had come back with some really great reference, bighorn sheep, as well as lots of really amazing landscape reference from the Rocky Mountains there. And so I wanted to do a painting that told the story of these bighorn sheep rams in that wilderness. So I began by creating a series of thumbnails, and this is the thumbnail I chose. It has a sort of a wrapping composition to it. I knew that I wanted, in terms of light, which is important to this demonstration, I wanted a story to be told where most of the rams, and in fact the foreground and much of the middle ground, were actually in diffused light, were not in direct light. But I wanted the hero ram at the peak to be hitting the light to help tell this story. And so you can see here that the sketch is incredibly rough. It's just a series of lines, shapes, etc. So I'll move on to going and finding the photographic reference for this piece. Once I've decided on a thumbnail sketch, I come back in and I start trying to track down the elements I'm going to need in order to build that painting. I'm using, in this case, Photoshop. I used to do it in a very traditional way, which I'll demonstrate with this piece later on, but this is a tool that really speeds the process up of building a conceptualized painting ready to go to canvas. So I've located the reference, pieces of reference that I want to use in the painting. So when I'm out photographing, I'm really just looking for pieces for a painting. I'm shooting rocks, I'm shooting clouds. I'm never or seldom taking entire landscapes and going, oh, that's what's going to be in the painting. I'm really just shooting to build something that I want to do. And so I'm looking for pieces. In this case, you'll see how I utilized it here in a minute, but I really was looking for just some foreground rocks to help anchor the composition. These were what I ended up using as middle ground rocks in the painting that the bighorn sheep are both climbing over and moving behind. And the same thing here, the foreground rocks that I'd chosen were really complicated, and so I wanted to find some rocks that would create rest areas within the foreground. And so I'll pull from this image as well. These are the background mountains I wanted to use. So when I'm photographing reference for a painting like this, generally speaking, all of the references from the same basic location. The reason being you don't want to end up with sort of plant material or types of rocks and things that are from entirely different locations that really don't belong in the setting you're trying to construct. So I try to make sure that the reference is all from the same area. This is the start of some of the rams. In this situation, you have a series of rams that are in shadow, and you have one ram that's in light, but only in partial light. And sometimes what I'll do is I will Frankenstein together the rams that I want. If I don't like a head the way it is, I just change the head. If I want a head in light, I put a head in light and the rest of the body in shadow. You just sort of piece together what you need. It is a true definition of using reference. And here's some more rams. So for the rams that are in more subtle light, I can get away with a lot. anytime you're painting something that is in indirect light and you're combining it with something that is in direct light, which is the case with this painting, I can get away with a lot of manipulation in terms of shadow. None of the shadows are really hard. And when it comes to how the painting looks and how well everything fits together in terms of lighting, that's really the key. You can combine hard lighting elements with much more diffused, softer lighting elements as long as the shadows are even close, because it's easy, very easy in fact, to manipulate soft shadows on a piece. Like in these guys here on screen, their shadows are very soft, very ill-defined. You can tell it's just more that they're lit from above than any particular direction. And since shadows define the forms of things, anytime you have a hard lit situation, you have a lot of structure that's being defined by those shadows. And that's difficult to make up. But in terms of softer shadows, it's a little easier to invent things. So what I've done here is I'm just going through these rams and finding the ones that I think would work best with what I've got in my concept sketch. Nothing fits exactly the way I wanted it in my concept sketch. I don't have a perfect memory for what photographs I have taken and what I have available to me. But I'm looking for a generalization of that just to achieve that goal of what's in the concept sketch. I know I want a lot of movement in the piece, I want a lot of direction in the piece, and so I'm looking for parts that will create that for me. And these are the various rams that are in the painting. So once the rough sketch is done and all the materials I need in order to build the painting are completed, I can then move on to beginning to build the concept in Photoshop and how I want that all to play out. So it usually starts with the background. When I'm building a concept in Photoshop, in the same way I would approach a painting, is I generally start back to front, top to bottom. And so that allows me to really keep control over the atmospheric depth and how much I want it manipulated or exaggerated or how accurate I want it to be. So these are those mountains. And it's actually a section of the mountains rather than the entire mountainscape that I had photographed in the reference earlier. There are a number of pitfalls that you can run into when you're dealing with reference photography. One of them is the obvious, which is the exaggeration various lenses can create on the scene. So if you have, for example, a really strong telephoto lens, you're going to collapse all of the space between you and your subject and the background. And that collapsing of space creates something I like to refer to as the flattening of planes, so that you get a really defined foreground, middle ground, and background without any connective tissue between the two, without any real sense of perspective. And that's something you want to avoid, particularly in wildlife art. It can be difficult when you're talking about mountain scenes, and the reason is because just by nature of the terrain, the plains tend to be highly separated. There's often vast distances when you're at the tops of mountains between where you're standing or where your subject is and the background behind them. And so I try in the work, when I run into those problems, to create something that helps connect them or that creates a stronger sense of depth between the foreground, middle ground, and background. And in this case, I know that starting with these background mountains, I want to create a sense of depth, and part of that is going to be by adding humidity to the air, essentially atmospheric depth to the air. So the foreground, because it's in shadow, I want it to stand off of the shadowed parts of the background of the mountain as well. And so I add a little bit of lightning back there to improve that situation. Next, we'll move on to the middle ground. And the middle ground starts with the rocks. So this is just a basic cropping out of rocks that were in one of the pieces of reference that I had before. And they're following my sketch. I know I want that really strong dominant rock in the foreground, or in the middle ground on this case, for that hero ram to be standing on. Once I've got that established, I know that I want it to be darker than it really is to help push it off of that background even more, and so I darkened it a little bit. Then we move into arranging the rams. It starts with the little guy in the background. One of the reasons why the rams are positioned the way they are in this piece is they help, just by their position, create a sense of depth. If they were all standing on the same plane, you would just reinforce that separation between planes. So if they're moving through space in the piece, even though you're dealing with a section that appears very flat, it helps to create a sense of space and depth within the painting. And so these two rams are behind the rocks as a way of doing that. And then we have the hero ram at the top. So what I've done here is I actually literally cut the head off of one of the rams in the pieces of reference I showed you, as well as one of the bodies from a different ram, and put them together in order to create him just popping into the light at the top of that rock. Now we move into the foreground parts of reference. So I'll start by, this foreground in this piece is very complicated. And it doesn't need to be at all. In fact, it shouldn't be, because the viewer is going to need places to rest. And so we'll start by putting in the foreground rocks. And even that is a little complicated for what I wanted to achieve. And so I added more just to sort of create larger, broader areas of stone that would allow the eye to rest in the foreground. Once that's completed, then I put that really strong anchoring element that I had talked about earlier. And that also gives me a series of angles for the bighorn sheep to be traveling across based on their positions in the reference that I've selected for it. This is one of the reasons in painting from life is very important, because it will help eliminate another pitfall of using reference photography, and that is scale. And relationships of scale. When you paint from life, you begin to develop a pretty intuitive sense of what scale should be of various elements based on how much depth is between them. And that is definitely the case here. You want to make sure that the relationships of sizes of all of these guys make sense in terms of how they're moving through space. And so I always take a moment to kind of compare their sizes with each other to make sure that they're actually getting a little smaller as they move further back in space. And then that was the last ram at the top of the hill there. Now he isn't actually standing on anything, so I had to create another rock that he could actually put his front hooves on. And that is the concept sketch for that piece and how I've gone about building a very complex painting. Now, when I start a painting that isn't complex, the same rules essentially apply, but I can do it in a way that is much simpler. There isn't as much necessary in terms of what needs to be done. So I've chosen the elements for this painting and the idea for this painting specific to talk about how you can inject more light and color into your piece. In the case of this painting, the idea is really simple, partially because of the format. Like in a really small format like this, you can't get away with doing too much in the way of complexity. So I just wanted some strong lines compositionally in terms of having this deadfall in here, some nice, really hard lights and darks to emphasize what I want to do in terms of light and color. And I've chosen a white subject because there's a lot of opportunity to do things with color when you're painting with white. People often do think of white as being something generic, but in fact, white is often a reflection of the light around it, an absorption of the light around it, and we're going to talk about that today as I paint. So it's easy to approach a much simpler painting in a more traditional way. Now, if you're going to do a very complex painting, the same approach that I would have for this swan, for example, is going to apply. It's just going to take a lot longer because there's a lot more refinement involved, a lot more in terms of trying to figure out all those relationships over. You can't just easily scale something down or scale something up. You essentially have to redraw everything. And that's one of the benefits of using something like Photoshop to design a painting, is that all of those changes that would occur maybe over 1 or 2 weeks can occur over just 1 or 2 hours that you would use. So, as with any painting, I just start with a rough sketch. This painting and this demonstration is all about light and color, and how that's going to play out in the demo was reflected in the sketch. I knew that as a single subject, with really strong light, and the story is all about that light and texture, and so there really wasn't a lot necessary to be in there. There just needed to be strong value contrasts and a very simple value structure. So once I've got the rough sketch, then I begin by, the first thing I do is, doing this traditionally, I will draw out my format to the correct ratio of what I'm painting on. In this case, it's an 11 by 14. So I make sure that this sketch starts in a true 11 by 14 frame. Once I've done that, then I can roughly start sketching in the drawing and a little bit more refined. Now, I don't have to make everything refined. I know that bushes and grasses and logs, I don't have to really draw those out. Those can just be drawn straight onto the canvas without any thought as to their detail or such, because that's just going to come from the reference. But I do want to make sure that the swan itself, the subject, looks accurate and that there aren't a lot of errors there that I have to correct when I move to canvas. And so I go ahead and start sketching them out and make them really more refined. Now, if I was doing something very complicated, it would be at this stage, but there would be a lot more elements involved. And so what I do is, after I've gotten to this stage and the proportions of everything seem right, then I can go into the detail phase of it. And what I do is I actually just layer pieces of tracing paper over the previous drawing, and I can still maintain all of that structure and those relationships of scale while detailing the drawing at the same time. And so if you're moving through something really complicated, you can just continue to do that until the drawing is as refined as you like, without having to freehand draw, so to speak, right out of the gate for every revision, where subtle things may change. This is a great way to keep everything just the way you intended it when you first drew it. And so this is another layer of the drawing that is much more refined. And this is as far as I ever need to go in terms of creating a drawing for a painting. Most drawings for paintings, they just go straight to canvas. They never end up on paper. I just look at the reference and draw it straight onto the canvas. In this case, I'm doing this to show you how you can do it, because you can apply these particular techniques to creating a complex painting, not just something very simple where you have a single subject. Once this is done, then I can just transfer it to the canvas if I want to. In the case of this, it's super simple, so I don't really necessarily have to do that. I just, in this case, just drew it straight onto the canvas without doing any transferring of the drawing. And that's how you build a painting from photographic reference. Stick around, and now we're going to talk about what materials and supplies I use and how they might benefit you. So let's talk a little bit about materials and supplies. So I like to keep things pretty simple in my studio. I don't use a wide array of colors. I have a fairly limited palette, and the same is true with my brushes. I predominantly use just bristle flats, numbers 2 through 12, depending on the size of the painting. And then I have a secondary set of brushes that are also flats. They're synthetics, which are a little softer, in the same sizes. So nothing in particular that's very special about those. As far as the substrates I paint on, I use a medium textured linen mounted to, in this case, birchwood. Anything above 16 by 20, I generally switch to linen mounted to gator board, which is a little less susceptible to environmental conditions in terms of expansion and contraction. It's very rigid, and it's very light, so it's easy to transport and easy to paint on. In this case, this is an oil primed medium textured linen, and that's what I use there. As far as my colors and my color palette, it is a fairly limited palette, and I find, because I work predominantly with nature, the palette works really well for what I do. My palette consists of a set of primary colors that I use all the time, and then I'll introduce a few secondary colors occasionally, depending on what the painting requires. So my palette is yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, cad red, anthracnone red, burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, and viridian. And that is the bulk of the colors I use 95% of the time, in addition to a titanium white. Colors that will make their way into my palette occasionally, depending on my needs, are cobalt blue, sap green occasionally, and Windsor green, which is actually a phthalo green. I tend to mix my deepest blacks using anthracnone red and Windsor green, so Windsor green will make it onto the palette occasionally. I also have introduced quick dry white, which is a titanium white. I like the way it works in producing an impasto, and so that has found its way onto my palette as well. But other than that, the only mediums I use are Liquin and Artist's Painting Medium by Winsor & Newton. I use the Liquin very sparingly, only at the beginning stages of the painting to do the initial block in, to tone the canvas, that kind of thing. After that, I don't really use any medium at all to thin my paints. The Artist's Painting Medium is used predominantly to oil out. So when areas of my painting dry, as I'm working in various stages, I'll oil out, rub a thin coat of oil over the painting, wipe off the excess, and then continue working into it. And it gives the effect of working wet into wet without actually disrupting the colors that I've already laid down. And that is all I use in terms of materials. All right, now we're going to start with the initial block-in of this swan painting. Now, to begin with, all I've done at this particular stage is I've just toned my canvas with a mix of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna in equal parts, thinned with Liquin, wiped on, and then I wipe off the excess and let it dry overnight. After that, I've gone ahead and just roughed in the drawing very quickly, all the basic landmarks, nothing too detailed, and I do that using the exact same mixture I used to tone the canvas. So just ultramarine, burnt sienna, thinned with Liquin, and then I've let that dry as well. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by mixing up a series of background colors. I always like to start back, top to bottom, back to front. It allows me to play with edges, manipulate edges and stuff as I move through the piece, decide where I want to do that in a little simpler way. But initially I will start with what I want to achieve in terms of the dark. So I will first put in the absolute darkest spots. I know that by doing that, I can judge all the values backwards from there. Everything after that is lighter than those darkest spots. And in terms of the block-in, I'm not worried too much about reaching those brightest brights or reaching those darkest darks. I just want to get the canvas covered with the very basic value structure, with the very basic colors and color temperatures. Nothing is finalized after this stage. It's really just to get the canvas covered and get a nice ground on which to lay subsequent layers of paint. So I'm mixing up a mixture that is not technically a black, but it'll be a very, very dark brown. I'm doing that by mixing ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and I'm warming it by adding just a little anthracnone red. Anthracnone red on my palette has been switched out instead of using alizarin crimson. And it has a little better light fast quality, meaning that it tends to perform better under long-term lighting conditions. It doesn't fade as quickly. And it's about the same price as alizarin crimson, and it behaves almost identically. And so it was a good replacement. And that's what I use instead of alizarin. So if you're using alizarin crimson, I definitely recommend trying out using anthracnone red as a replacement for it, because I think in the long term, you'll experience less fade in your paintings if they end up under a lot of light. At this stage in the block-in, this will be the last time I use Liquin, is through the block-in phase. And I'll thin it almost to the, not quite to the consistency of the Liquin itself, just maybe a little bit above. When I choose a brush for painting, I always want to choose a brush that is a little bigger than what I think I actually need. It tends to restrict me from putting in too much detail and focus more on the quality of my brushwork. And so I would recommend switching when you're painting to brushes that make you feel just a little uncomfortable in terms of how much detail you can achieve with them and how precise you can be. As I paint these shadows, even at this stage, I'm paying attention to transitions of temperature as they move further away from the viewer, so in towards the back. So I'm going to cool these slightly as they move back in and in behind the swan. Now, because this is a fairly rough drawing, and when you do this, when you draw in a piece with paint, you end up with what are fairly thick lines, unlike with pencil. And that can actually affect the accuracy of the anatomy and things like that. And so when you come back in with a brush and paint, I tend to cut into the lines. I think of the swan existing inside of that actual outline. And so the paint I'm using will come in and cover that line. Otherwise, the swan can end up looking more bulky than he should. In this case, it's with a swan. But there are animals where it's really important to make sure their bulk is accurate. Particularly like with deer legs or pronghorn legs or things like that, a lot of times they end up getting painted, I've seen in wildlife art, they end up getting painted thicker than they should, and because they're actually very narrow anatomically. And I think some of that might have to do with the fact that it's just a subtle difference between painting outside this line and painting on just to the inside of it. That little shaving off of the bulk makes a big difference. In terms of light and color, this piece has a very strong flow of light in it. It is hard left to right. So you're moving from what is essentially a strong shadowed area into very bright, illuminated, sort of glowing swan over in this section. And as I move further along, certainly into the second stages, I'll talk a little bit more about how you can manipulate texture in the piece to use to improve the lighting, the perception of lighting in your painting. For example, I generally, as a general rule, as I move further along the painting, the brush strokes will follow the forms of things. But if you ever have seen your paintings lit appropriately in a gallery or in a museum, lighting is almost always overhead. And so you can use that situation to improve the lighting situation in your painting, have it reflect light back at the viewer. So I'm not just thinking about in terms of strokes, following the forms so that I can define the volume with the strokes as well, but I'm also thinking about how the strokes will reflect light back at the viewer. And when you're in a situation with like white, swan, or even in a landscape where you have snow and stuff, you can use that bouncing of light to really create jewel-like effects in the painting that really punch up the way light is perceived. And I'll discuss that a little further as we move further along into the second stage of the painting. For now, it really is all about getting the canvas covered. And so I've got, what I generally do is I will mix up a big block of color and work my way off of that, changing its temperature and value in one direction, and the same thing in the other direction, just in the opposite way. So I'll mix up sort of a medium value, so to speak, and then that medium value will get pushed off of each side so that one side of it is getting lighter as I work in lighter values and change the temperature, and the other side is going to get darker as I need to change the temperature values. In this case, this is all a shadowed area. So I started with what I wanted to be my darkest dark. And the side that I'm pulling off here is just making it lighter and moving into those sort of shadowed mid-tones where I've added a little bit of Viridian to improve the green, as well as graying that green with a touch of burnt sienna. I find burnt sienna works very well in terms of greens, mixing it with Viridian. When you're talking about the locations in which I'm painting, certainly in terms of Western landscapes and wildlife, that combination added with a little yellow ochre or a little cad yellow will go a long way to creating variation in greens that is true to the Rocky Mountain West. If I was painting a lot of eastern landscapes or where you had a lot of variation in greens, I would mix them a little differently and maybe even introduce a different green into there that I could use to create variation. I've always found, and I think a lot of artists do, find greens are one of the trickier colors to mix, but they don't have to be. It doesn't take a lot of variation. I think where most artists run into trouble is they change the value of greens by adding white, and that often leads to chalky, sort of flat greens. And I try to avoid adding any white to greens when I can. It does happen occasionally, but I try to avoid it. And if I do, I add in either cad yellows or yellow ochres to make sure that it doesn't go too cold and chalky. I'm going to add some yellow ochre to my palette here. As well as a little quick dry white. The difference between quick dry white and your standard titanium white, because quick dry white is a titanium based white, it just has an alkali resin in it and some other things to help speed its drying time. And it will speed it very quickly, much more so than just like straight liquid or dryer even. It will, this white that I've just placed down in a couple of hours will be very stiff. It won't even feel like paint anymore. Which I like because I can use that to my advantage for creating texture, and particularly later on. But for now, I'm just using it because I always want the block end to dry fairly quick, certainly overnight. Just catching the tops of these grasses with some highlighted grass, but I don't want it to go too cold. I find in the studio in particular, it's a different scenario if you're plein air painting or painting on location. I find actually testing the paints and comparing them on the canvas works a little better for me in the studio, as opposed to mixing everything here and comparing everything here. So I'll mix something up, test it, and then make any adjustments that are necessary. Now, even at this stage, I'm just paying attention to the directions of the grass, the strokes themselves, where they fall. I don't want to do anything too detailed, but I still want the strokes to work for me as opposed to against me. At the end of the block end, I will take a very soft sable brush and sort of dry brush off and blend out any of the paint that is built up in areas. I don't want any paint texture at this stage. I want all of that to happen at the final two stages, and I'll just have to end up fighting it if I leave it in at this stage. So I have Cad Red still on my palette, and I still consider it one of my permanent colors on my palette, the ones that make it there every time. But I find I don't really use it that much. It may end up becoming a secondary color that I just introduce when I need it. But in this case, there is use for it, so it will actually get used on this palette. You'll notice that the dab of it is much smaller than everything else, because I just won't use a lot of it, and as we all know, any heavy metal based paint is an expensive paint. Speaking of expensive paints and talking about tools, I can't recommend enough how important it is that, especially if you're just starting out trying to paint, that you spend the money on good tools, good quality paints. They will, if you're buying student grade paints or very cheap paints, they will fight you the whole time. And you'll think it's because of your skill level, and really it's just the quality of your materials. So definitely buy professional quality materials and tools so that you eliminate one of the problems you would run into if you're just starting out and just learning how to do this. part of building a really strong sense of light is getting accurate the contrasts of values. That is probably the number one way of building a really strong sense of light in a piece, making sure those values are good, strong, they contrast with each other. The other is injecting color into, for example, into shadowed areas and bouncing colors of the appropriate value into shadowed areas where you might not otherwise think it belongs. You might think, in the case of this composite reference here, that this area is really just sort of one simple color. You can get away with just making it a warm, dark area. But I find I like to build in lots of bouncing reflected color into those areas. And that injection of color into there helps liven up shadows, makes them appear more transparent, which shadows are, and just creates a lot more interest in the piece in areas. Creating interest in the piece wherever you can is key to also creating subtlety. And that's the difference between what are good paintings and what are great paintings. It really is the subtlety of things being used, the subtlety of color usage, the subtlety of brushwork. You can paint something certainly very bold and really intense, but putting subtlety in areas where you can, spending the time to improve what you might otherwise not really consider needs much improvement or needs much work, is the difference between really good paintings and just paintings that are okay. And I'm going to mix up a slightly even darker color here, basically a version of purple, just to bring in some of these slightly darker areas, even though they don't really need to go as dark as I want them yet. So by way of placing him at the edge of what is essentially a shadowed sort of middle ground, so that his brightest areas overlap that dark. That's how, in this particular case, I am achieving a really strong sense of light, is that kind of hyper contrast between these two values. Now, of course, there's all kinds of ways to inject light, and it doesn't necessarily have to be such a strong lighting condition. You can definitely have lighting conditions that are more indirect or more subtle, cloudy day kind of scenes, things like that, where the light is every bit as interesting and dramatic. The difference is that if you are just kind of starting out learning how to paint in such a way as to bring really strong light into your work, high contrast paintings like this are a bit easier to tackle. Subtlety is very hard in oil painting. Artists, including myself, will probably spend their whole lives trying to achieve it to any sort of high degree. And indirect lighted paintings, where you don't have really strong sunlight or really strong lighting conditions, there's a lot of subtlety that has to happen in there to get the very minute changes in value that are required. So they can be more difficult to paint. So if you're just kind of tackling this idea of really wanting to inject light and color into your paintings, I would start out with something more high contrast. I think it's just easier to tackle. It's easier to mix the colors, and even a little easier, I think, to judge values. You have to be very sensitive to how values transition, how temperatures transition, if you're painting something in indirect light. And that's a skill level that doesn't come easily. So if you just want to avoid a little frustration and if you first kind of go around on this, I would say choose an idea where the lighting is very strong and dramatic. So now I can kind of move into the lighter areas of the piece. So we're going to grab some cad yellow, a little quick dry white as well as titanium white. Just a touch of burnt sienna to that. We'll see. Looks, yeah, and then a little bit of anthracnone red. Now, yellow is a tricky color in terms of light because it has such high chroma. In other words, such a saturation of color that it appears very bright, even though its value might not be so. And so it's a little bit of an exception to the rule that value is the absolute key to whether something looks real. If you can get the values right, it'll look real no matter what color you paint it. Something of this high chroma but low value can deceive you a little bit. And so I always, if somebody sees something very bright in terms of yellow, I always say to paint it a little brighter than what you might think it is supposed to look like, because yellow does have, cad yellow in particular, its value is actually a lot darker than you might think it is by just observing it on your palette. Now, of course, our perception of color, just like value, is dependent upon the colors that surround them. So how intense a color looks, how bright it looks is assuming when you're talking about its associated value, is really dependent on what is happening around it as well. And so that's why I talk about in the studio, I just kind of enjoy comparing all of that stuff on the canvas as opposed to here. It's just easier for me to read. And you can see as I'm just working here, blocking in, I'm just working off that initial pile and sort of transitioning it through these variations of color that I need to have happen in these brighter areas. And again, at this stage, you're just keeping the paint very thin, just basically covering things up. You want this, using these techniques, you want this definitely to be dry in a short order. So by the next day for sure. Not getting the paint on it very heavily will help that. Because in the next stage, I'll be layering over the top of it. And I don't want it, I want to use that color that's underneath and not be fighting it, in the way of creating mud or disturbing what I've already done. I just want to use it as I allow color being layered over the top to break and let that underpainting, so to speak, show through. When you get into areas like this, especially at this stage, none of that is important to tell the story in terms of those leaves or any of that stuff. You just want to paint them as solid shapes. And that's kind of how I'm approaching this whole process, certainly at the block-in phase, is that I'm establishing basic shapes. I'm not establishing anything in the way of detail. And the way to achieve that, a high level of detail when painting this way, is that you paint everything in the largest shapes you can in terms of breaking them down. You know, this whole area might be one shape. This whole area might be one shape, excluding this little shape here. And then you break these larger areas down into smaller shapes, and you just keep working your way down until you get the painting as detailed as you like, allowing you to refine it the whole way. But at the block-in phase, nothing more is required than just having those basic shapes to tell the story. You do not have to go in and start rendering a bunch of detail. And in wildlife art anyway, and actually I find this just in paintings in general, is that the more rendered they are, the more detail involved, oftentimes the stiffer they get. There's a strange balance that occurs between highly rendered pieces and pieces that have a lot more brushwork or interpretation. I don't know where that balance lies for me in terms of what I prefer aesthetically, but I definitely know that I prefer work that is less detailed than work that is more detailed and that has more interesting brushwork. That tells a story. I find there's a really high level of skill required the more you can achieve with less brushwork. So there's a kind of economy of stroke that happens where you can tell the story with less strokes, but you get more information in the stroke. And that is a very difficult skill to achieve. There's a number of artists I admire whose work they're very good at that. And it's something I kind of strive for in my work, and certainly still learning to do, is finding that balance, that economy of stroke. Where is that? What can I get away with? What needs just one stroke, and what do I have to fiddle with more to tell the story? And that's sort of a work in progress for me. So in terms of light, I'm doing some things here that they might not, I'll emphasize further even as I go along in the painting process, but you really don't have to pay absolute attention or be a slave to your reference. I know that purple is a wonderful complement, obviously, to reds and oranges. And so these logs that are in shadow, rather than going really gray with them, I'll go slant them more to kind of a sort of warm purple. And so just bumping up the saturation of color or the chroma in these areas is an important way to inject more life into the painting in terms of color, creating a little bump in the stronger contrasts of complements through shadows, etc. And as long as you're getting the value right, having a little more intense color happening than what might appear in your images is always beneficial to the piece. Paintings almost never suffer from exploring color a little higher. They tend to suffer the more gray and muddy they get. And so if you keep the chroma a little higher, and just make sure you get the values as close to accurate as you're capable of, you're going to end up with more interesting paintings and a lot better sense of light and color in your paintings. In terms of mixing color and keeping it clean so that you achieve the strongest impact on the surface, I find there's a few things you can do, just sort of really simple tips. One is that you should always get into the habit of making sure when you're going into the color, even at this stage where it's not as important, when you go into the color, you lay down whatever stroke you want, and you don't just dump back into the color. You take and wipe your brush. And the reason is you want to wipe your brush after every stroke is when the painting starts getting full of varying values and colors here, and it's all wet still, you're picking up color that you might not necessarily even realize you're doing while you're laying down a color. And so when you pick that up and you go back into that nice clean color you've mixed, you're adding just a little bit more mud to that situation. And over time, as you're painting, it just kills the chroma, sways the values in ways you weren't intending. And so by wiping that brush after every time it leaves the canvas, you'll go a long way to helping avoid creating those effects that we try to avoid when we're talking about clean color, etc. One of the other things is to not overmix. Certainly as I move further along in this painting, I will leave the color, as I mix colors for the canvas, I'll leave them more marbled and less mixed. The more you mix colors, the further you move towards gray. And so I will not mix them as heavily as I might at this stage, where I'm mixing up these sort of big piles and then working off of them. And then the other tip I would say is to, in terms of just a real practical kind of habit to get into, is that while in a block-in phase I might use 1 or 2 brushes at the most, I'll have a lot more brushes going as I move further along in the painting, because if I make major value or temperature shifts, I'll get a new brush. So I might use just this brush for these very dark areas, and then I'll get another brush of the same size, for example, and the same type, and just use it for the light areas. And I won't mix the two, because even cleaning it and stuff, you're still not getting it quite clean enough to avoid, letting colors invade other areas that they might not necessarily want. Hi, this is Dustin Van Wechel, and welcome to my workshop. I'm going to teach you how to interject more color and light into your wildlife work. Light is how we see, it's how form is defined, and using it in wildlife to create a sense of drama is really important. My approach is probably a little different than some other artists in that I try to take a very systematic approach to the work. I would like to have the problems in the work solved before it even reaches canvas. So that sort of systematic approach might make it a little easier to provide a kind of map for students to use. I think the way this video enhances students' painting skills is by really focusing on some very fundamental aspects of painting and allowing the student to really tackle those things in a very direct way. So things like mixing value and its associated colors, color temperatures, brush work, what brushes will produce what kind of effects, knife work, all of those things, textural elements. I think honing in on all of those very specifically will really enhance the students' work. I'm really excited to bring you this workshop about painting wildlife and specifically interjecting more light and color into your work. Come with me and let's tackle this piece and see where it goes. I'm Dustin Van Wechel. I'm an artist and predominantly a wildlife painter. I grew up in a small town in Arizona called Quartzsite, Arizona. I'd always drawn and painted since I can remember. I don't have anybody in particular in my family that is artistically inclined, but I did have a lot of encouragement from my parents and family. It wasn't until we moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and I was suddenly dumped into a city with no friends or anything that pretty quickly teachers and kids started realizing I could draw, and it sort of became a way actually of making friends when I was little. And I think that's why I still do it, honestly. It became a part of who I was. Went from making friends to inevitably in high school just doing it on my own for pure enjoyment. I literally can't remember a time when I wasn't doing it. I've always been drawing. I think I'm one of those folks who doesn't really believe in talent in the same way a lot of people sort of mystify it. I think talent is, if talent exists, it's really in the drive to do something. I mean, we all excel at things better than others. Mine happens to be art, and I think it was just because I was just dedicated to it very early on, drawing all the time. I had a sketchbook with me all the time. I was even drawing on my desks when I didn't have paper in front of me as a little kid, so like in class and things. So I think that's really the difference. it's the love of it that really sets people apart. Yeah, it didn't really have an impact on my artwork in terms of me having a desire to draw and paint, but it definitely had an impact in that they were incredibly supportive, like always supportive. Through high school, they were happy to send me to art school, get me instruction. Like there was a time when I was in elementary school where they hired my elementary school art teacher to take me after school to teach me to do art as well, like work with me as an artist. And that was all stuff I was interested in, and they were perfectly supportive of all of it. And I think that was the key, really, was the support. At the time, I was sort of in that peak hunger for art and finding work. When I was a kid, I was maybe I was just in high school from maybe freshman year to senior year, and I was really starting to notice science fiction and fantasy illustrators like Jeff Easley and Boris Vallejo and Frank Frazetta in particular, and there was just a host of them, and I just gobbled that stuff up. I loved everything about it and would copy their books and their book covers, and yeah, that was really where it all really started. As you grow as an artist and you're looking for new work and stuff, you sort of start stumbling across artists who are more commonly cited amongst great painters. There's Anders Zorn and Edgar Payne and there was just a host of those kinds of artists that you came across, and all of those are influences. Even contemporary artists like Clyde Aspervig or a number of landscape painters. T. Allen Lawson, for example. All of those guys, I sort of started coming into contact with their work in my early 20s, and they definitely had a big influence. Early on, just normal elementary school stuff, where you had art classes and that kind of thing. The difference was I was drawing in every class. It didn't matter what I was in art class or not. I don't have a traditional painting background in terms of art. Once I graduated high school, I went to college and I actually went to commercial arts. I have a degree in visual communications, which is essentially graphic design. So my work was at the time really heavily computer focused and graphic design focused and production, like in print production and video production and things like that. And so I went into advertising agencies. My first job out of school was working for a software company, actually in their art department. And I continued to do like a little illustration work for those various companies, sometimes for the agencies I was working for, the advertising agencies, but just growing more and more frustrated with the lack of a creative outlet, because I always felt like you were really just a wrist producing work for other people in advertising, and the culture itself I didn't really care too much. And so I eventually just decided to quit one day, like literally overnight, decided to quit and just pursue fine art. I started painting as a full-time artist in 2002, February of 2002. But I started my career painting with pastels, actually, and it wasn't until about 2007 or 8, right in there, that I switched over to oil paints. I had always wanted to be a fine artist. I just didn't know it was possible to make a living at it. Honestly, I was sort of operating under that myth that you're going to starve as an artist. And so I went into commercial art and became a designer and eventually an art director working in advertising. But I met a couple of artists along the way who really encouraged me to give it a shot. And I think over time I sort of developed the courage to finally just leave my job and make a go of it. I had saved up some money, and so I had about a year's worth of income I had set aside that I could really try and build a portfolio with and focus on creating some work I could take to galleries. And that was how it all started. In 2002, my wife agreed to let me quit my job. That was number one. But we sort of made a plan. Like I said, I had some money saved up, and it wasn't like I just went in like cold turkey. I had been thinking about this for a while. And so we didn't have any debt. I didn't have car payments or credit card debt. I didn't own a home. And I had enough money for a year to save up. So we decided that we would move to the middle of nowhere, actually, in Nebraska. I lived in a town called Glenville. There was 103 people in town. And the idea was that it was very inexpensive to live. It was fairly close to my wife's family. And it was centralized to the shows I knew I would want to be doing. So there were some East Coast shows and some West Coast shows, and I still had access to the Rocky Mountains, which is sort of my obsession in my work and my first love. And so in 2002, I started working on a portfolio, and I was painting in pastels. And there happened to be a town about a half an hour away from us that was a little bigger. It's about 25,000 people. And there was a gallery owner there who I was introduced to through mutual friends. And she asked to see the work I was making. And so I showed her, and she immediately asked me, this is within just like maybe 2 or 3 months of having moved to Nebraska in 2002. She asked me if I'd be willing to do a show with the gallery. I, of course, agreed. It gave me, a deadline to work towards, and it was like 6 months out. And so I just started producing work for that show. I did 18 paintings, of which I think 14 of them sold opening night during the show. And so I thought, yay, I'm gonna be rich. This is amazing. I had no idea. And that obviously isn't the case, but it was very encouraging, and it provided me another year basically of income that I could continue working and building more portfolio, a bigger portfolio, and trying to get into other galleries and shows. And it just sort of snowballed from there. I got into a few shows. At one point, I was doing like 9 shows in a year, traveling all over the country. I've since been able to whittle that down, but that was how it went. It went that way for about 10 years. From about 2002 to like late 2011. In 2011, early 2012, right around there, I got into a major Western gallery, was invited into the gallery. And from that point on, it was a whole different industry to me, a whole different thing. Like they sold every painting I do, and the nice thing was there's a really, really incredibly talented roster of artists in the gallery. And so it really forced me to elevate my own work. I was constantly worried about placing my work in the gallery and having it suffer by comparison with these sort of titans of Western art. And so I really tried to get better and get better very quickly. And the gallery was able to really introduce me to a lot of people, a lot of museum people, like the Autry National Center and the Booth Museum and National Museum of Wildlife Art. And it was through that gallery that I came into contact with a really extraordinary group of collectors and art lovers. And it's been sort of, haven't looked back ever since. I would describe it as painterly realism. It's definitely not impressionistic. It is not, while it can look photorealistic to some people, I think if you actually really look at the work, you'll find that it isn't nearly as photorealistic as its initial impression is. So I would say painterly realism. There's a painterly quality to it. As a painter, you're always thinking about what style it is and what it means to your work. You can think of it in the same terms you might as your signature. And in that regard, I think I'm at least on a direction where my paintings are unique enough that they can be recognized as my own. And that's really what sets me apart. But I have all the same worries and all the same fears and all the same joys that other artists have. I do it for many of the same reasons most artists I've ever come into contact with do it. And so in that regard, we're kind of the same. It's really that signature of how I lay down paint that maybe separates me from other artists. I think the simplicity of my technique goes a long way to separating me. I don't use a lot of different tools, a lot of different colors, a lot of different brushes, that kind of stuff. I really do keep things fairly simple. And so my palette is, I think, and the way it looks in terms of my finished work is recognizable to me. The way I lay down paint, the fact that I'm using all flats creates, just on its own, without me having actually to do much, creates sort of its own look and how I handle that. I think that certainly in wildlife art, maybe what separates me from other wildlife artists is complexity. I definitely love the process of organizing complexity in a painting to create something that looks very authentic, but that you would never be able to photograph, for example. And that's definitely something different. A lot of wildlife artists, you know, they might interpret something, a photograph, changing the color a lot, or you know, just moving things around a little bit, but it's all from that image. I don't generally do that very often. In fact, almost never really. And I think that sort of separates my work from others. There's always a lot of motion, a lot of, especially in the larger work, a lot of elements in the paintings, and I think that separates it a bit. I get out and I literally look for it. Like that's key. Let's be honest. The reality is that painting wildlife is just an excuse to get outdoors. Like, that is my favorite place to be. And wildlife is what inspires me most to paint, but it's all about like getting to the tops of mountains and things like that. I'm truly in love with the Rocky Mountain West, and there's no place like being at, you know, 12,000 feet, and the intensity of the light, and just the smells and the way it is up there. That's the best part of it. And it just happens that some of my favorite subjects are at those same altitudes. And so when I'm out there, you know, hiking, I'm looking for those subjects. I'm looking for those stories as well as just getting to enjoy the environment. That's actually a difficult question, because at this stage of my career, I'm incredibly busy, and I often find myself sort of trapped in the studio, not able to get out and explore, paint, photograph, whatever the case may be. And that's really where inspiration always comes from. It comes from those breaks. So it can be difficult. I think I find more joy in the painting now, maybe in terms of the quality of the work at the end. And so that sort of inspires me into getting into the next painting. I was certainly less satisfied with my work earlier on in my career. And so the motivation to paint came from that idea of, I've got to get better. The next painting is going to be better. And now it is, I'm a little more satisfied with the work, and so I want to jump into the next one to see what happens. And that's a lot of where inspiration comes from. But in the end, I just have to put down the brushes and get outside. Words of wisdom. I don't know. Yeah, as far as painting, I'd take two tracks. If you're working, if you have a day job and you've always wanted to be an artist, I would say the words of wisdom would be, stay out of debt, make sacrifices in terms of your time, and paint as often as you can. And eventually you'll be able to transition to being a fine artist. I think most people can make it if they really dedicate themselves to that. And in terms of just words of wisdom for somebody who already is a painter or that kind of thing, it's really very simple. It's just simply paint what you love. If you're not painting what you love, you're probably never going to be particularly successful. I think the people buying artwork can see when an artist loves what they're painting. And I don't know how artists can paint stuff and not really be in love with what it is they're doing. So love what you're painting. Don't just paint things because you think it's better for the market. Hi, this is Dustin Van Wechel, and welcome to my workshop. I'm going to teach you how to interject more color and light into your wildlife work. Light is how we see, it's how form is defined, and using it in wildlife to create a sense of drama is really important. My approach is probably a little different than some other artists in that I try to take a very systematic approach to the work. I would like to have the problems in the work solved before it even reaches canvas. So that sort of systematic approach might make it a little easier to provide a kind of map for students to use. I think the way this video enhances students' painting skills is by really focusing on some very fundamental aspects of painting and allowing the student to really tackle those things in a very direct way. So things like mixing value and its associated colors, color temperatures, brush work, what brushes will produce what kind of effects, knife work, all of those things, textural elements. I think honing in on all of those very specifically will really enhance the student's work. I'm really excited to bring you this workshop about painting wildlife and specifically interjecting more light and color into your work. Come with me and let's tackle this piece and see where it goes.